Hello and welcome to this video on income and wealth inequality. So in this video we're going to look at the Lorenz curve and Gini coefficient measures of inequality and then look at some of the causes and impacts of inequality. So let's start off with what we mean by wealth and income. Well, by wealth, and when we talk about wealth inequality, we're talking about tangible assets here. So wealth is a stock concept. So we're talking about how much people actually own. So for example, most people have their wealth in property or in shares or in works of art, for example. So we might talk about the inequality of what people own. Income is more of a flow concept. So income flows from you providing your labor or providing from rental income, that sort of thing. So income inequality refers to inequality based on incomes from wages, from rent, and from profit, how much money you're making from your assets. So to illustrate this idea of wealth inequality, we're going to have a look at a couple of examples here. Every year at the Davos summit, which is Davos down here, the world's richest and most powerful people meet. If we took the richest people in the world and we got them in order from the richest person, then the second richest person, the third richest person, and we got them all to board a bus, one at a time, how many of the richest in the world would need to get on the bus so that the bus contained as much wealth as the poorest 50%, the poorest 3.5 billion people in the world? How many people do you think? Well, the answer is about 26. The world's 26 richest people own as much in terms of wealth as the poorest half of the world. So we live in a world with significant wealth inequality. We can illustrate this further by looking at the USA. The richest 4 people in the USA own or have as much wealth as the bottom 40% of the population. In fact, Bill Gates alone is worth nearly all the wealth of the bottom 20% of the USA population by wealth. Now we're going to look at income inequality or income distribution. And this is how a nation's GDP is distributed amongst its population. So typically we'll see something like this. We'll have the number of people, so for example here millions of households, the number of people on this axis, and then earnings along the bottom. We can see that most households earn around 300 to 200 pounds a week. So the most common would be here, about 250 pounds a week. The median, which means we have 50% of the population to the left, 50% of the population to the right, is around here. And the mean is the average, so 463 pounds a week. And we can see that because there's a few people, not many of them, but quite a few who earn quite a lot per week, the mean is higher than the median and the mode here. So when we're talking about income distribution, we can talk about how equal the distribution is. So here on the left-hand side, income per year, if everyone in the entire country, if our country had 5 people in it, and they were all earning $10,000 per year, we have a perfectly equal distribution of income. However, if we had our similar amount of people in our economy, but one person was earning 50,000 and everyone else was earning nothing, we'd have a perfectly unequal distribution of income. One person earning everything and everyone else earning nothing. So we can talk about extremes here, but we can talk about more equal distributions of income and less equal distributions of income. So how do we measure income distribution? Well, one of the ways in which we do it is by looking at the Lorenz curve for a country. And the Lorenz curve is a curve showing the proportion of national income earned by a given percentage of the population, i.e. what proportion of national income is earned by the top 10% of the population. And so this is how we create a Lorenz curve. We have an axis here. On the left-hand axis, we have the cumulative percentage of national income, so how much of national income. And on the bottom, we have the cumulative percentage of the population, so how many people within the population. And we draw a 45-degree line. And this line represents the situation if income was distributed equally, i.e. the poorest 10% would earn 10%, the poorest 30% would earn 30% of the income. So as we move up this line, effectively what we're saying here is, okay, we've got the population lined up from the poorest to the richest. And if we take the bottom 10% of people, if they possess 10% of the population, that's an equal distribution. If we take the bottom 30% of people and they have 30% of the wealth, then everyone's getting 1% each. Obviously at the top here at the far right hand side, 100% of the people must by definition have 100% of the wealth. But when we plot our Lorenz curves in reality, we often don't find we have an equal distribution of income. So here's our line of equality. This shows an equal distribution of income with every extra percentage of the population getting the same percentage extra of the income. But we might have a line like this. And so, for example, here, the poorest 30% of the population don't have 30% of the income. It's not the line, it's not the equal distribution line. They actually have less. So the poorest percent of the population here only have 20% of the income. Now let's have a look at this country represented by the red line. In this country, it's even more unequal distribution of income. The poorest 30% of the population have less than 30%, less than 20%. They only have 7% of the national income. So the more that our Lorenz curve bends in like this, the more unequal the distribution of income. We're basically saying we get till very late in the population before all the wealth kicks in. Now let's move on to the Gini coefficient. The Gini coefficient relates to the Lorenz curve. So here we have our Lorenz curve. We have our line of equal distribution of income. And we have an area underneath this line. We then have our Lorenz curve, and our Lorenz curve splits that area into two. We have this area that's bounded between the line of equal distribution and the Lorenz curve, which we'll call A, and we have the second area outside of the curve called B. And the Gini coefficient is a number, and it's calculated by A divided by A plus B. So we're saying what proportion is A, this area between the line of equality and the actual distribution of income in the country, compared to this area as a whole. And as you can see, as you can kind of just intuitively see, as our Lorenz curve gets more unequal in terms of its distribution, A gets bigger, the area A gets bigger as a relative proportion of this triangle. So as A gets bigger, then the Gini coefficient will start to rise. We'll get a number closer to 1, and so a higher number here is going to tell us that that country has a more unequal distribution of income. So here is a little diagram that you might want to copy down into your notes. It summarizes everything that we need to know. So we have the Lorenz curve here represented by this line. We have the 45-degree line of equality, and we have our two areas, A and B. And as A gets bigger, we have a more unequal distribution of income, then the Gini coefficient will start to rise. So our Gini coefficient will give us an answer somewhere between 0 and 1. If it's 0, we have a perfectly equal income distribution. If it's 1, we have a perfectly unequal income distribution. So if we look around the world, here we can see where we have the most equal distributions and the most unequal distributions. So the kind of dark green countries down here, these are Gini coefficients of 0.3 or less. So when we have a look at Scandinavia in particular and parts of Eastern Europe, we see that they unsurprisingly have more equal distributions of income in those societies. When we get down to the pink areas and the red areas, we have areas where we have very unequal distributions of income. We have some very, very rich people and some, by comparison, to some poor people. So South America is well renowned for being quite unequal in terms of distribution of income. Southern Africa as well, very unequal distributions of income. We might notice actually that China and the USA have kind of somewhere in between, perhaps surprisingly unequal distributions of income in these countries. So what are causes of income and wealth inequality? Well, there's definitely a correlation between education attainment and income inequality and wealth inequality. Wage rates, perhaps minimum wages, the level of unemployment, the level of social benefits, whether this tax system is progressive or regressive, taxes on inheritance, the skills of people, the quality of the pensions, and again, what's happening to asset prices in these countries. All of these things can increase income and wealth inequality or reduce it. An interesting take on this was looked at by the economist Kuznets. And he said, actually, when you look at growing developing economies and turning them into developed economies, so when we talk about low level of per capita income countries compared to high levels of per capita income countries, often at low level per capita income countries, so you can see, sub-Saharan Africa actually tend not to have too much income inequality. Everyone is kind of poor compared to everybody else. When you get to very developed economies like Scandinavian economies, everyone is quite wealthy, but income inequality is quite low compared to everybody else. So there's this idea that actually you have to go through a stage of growing in income inequality to create an incentive for development, and then there comes a turning point at what point you reach a certain level of development where state tax systems kick in and inequality starts to reduce. So he says when you track many countries over time as they progress from developing to developed, you see income inequality rising, and then as they become more developed, eventually falling. But of course, there are many critics of this theory as well. So what is the significance of living in a capitalist or the modern capitalist society for inequality? Well, skills and education are linked to income inequality in a free market. If you have good skills and a good education, you go on to get a good job and earn the big money, you're going to be wealthy. If you have low skills, low education in a free market economy, there's nothing there to bail you out, so you're going to be poor. So skills and education in a free market might naturally link to income inequality. Private ownership of assets will lead to wealth inequality. If I own a house, this house then goes up in value. I can then use that value of that asset to secure higher rents, which can then fund further asset purchases for myself. And so it can become a bit of a spiral in that the wealthier people get, the more they acquire the assets within an economy. Some people argue that inequality provides an incentive to take risks. If I know that everyone earns the same, where's the incentive for me to work hard, particularly if it's going to be taken off me in tax and given to those who work less hard? So perhaps income inequality is perhaps desirable, and then it creates an incentive for those on low incomes to work hard because they know if they do, they will be rewarded with higher incomes if they're successful. So in this video, we've looked at measures of income, in particular inequality, the Lorenz curve and the Gini coefficient, and we've looked at some of the causes and impacts of income and wealth inequality. That's it. Thanks very much for listening.